So there's this very specific kind of chaos that only Star Wars could cause among its fans, and in 2017, things got a little messy. Star Wars Episode VIII, The Last Jedi, hit cinemas and set off an immediate tidal wave of reactions. Some people were blown away instantly, some people walked out disappointed, and certain others made it their whole personality to bitch about the movie online for a living. The conversation hasn't stopped since then, and while I would very much like it to, I can at least see why people still talk about it. I did not realise the sound was on there. The Last Jedi questions a lot about the mythos of the franchise. It questions how we define heroism, whether the stories we've clung to for decades are helping us or holding us back. For me, it works and I love it. When I first saw it, it connected with me on a level that I wasn't quite prepared for, considering it was my third Star Wars movie in cinemas and I wasn't really all that keen on the previous one. There's something about how it tackles failure, legacy, and that search for purpose that just appeals to me. It's not clean, and it's definitely not without its flaws, but I love it, and problems and all, it is my favourite Star Wars movie. Now, I do understand that this is a divisive one, and I would like to clarify that this will not be this blind positivity video, as I will be going into the problems that I have come to acknowledge within the film. But I want to reflect and attempt to untangle this strange, sometimes clumsy installment in a saga that I feel represents Star Wars best for me. We're going to talk about broken legends, the nature of empathy, the missteps and misfirings, and the moments of beauty that the film holds, and we're going to be respectful about it. Right? Because sometimes a story sticks with you in a way that travels far beyond the flaws, because it reaches for something you find so inherently sincere. So, with a reminder that everything in this video is my opinion and you are entitled to your own that I would love to debate in the comments, let's go. I think we should start with Luke because he's one of, if not the most polarising subject within the film. He's far from the grand Jedi that we left at the end of Return of the Jedi, and he's definitely not the version of Luke that fans expected to see, leading to many of them checking out and blaming Rian Johnson. As if he directed the previous movie where the entire story involves Luke being in hiding. The Last Jedi treats Luke as a man before it does a hero, making him someone that failed to live up to the mantle of the myth that he had been built up as. That failure then made him retreat from everything, from the galaxy, from hope, from the Force. It isn't hard for me to see why this could have hit a nerve for a lot of people though. Luke was the embodiment of optimism, and seeing him grumpy, bitter and worn down probably felt wrong for a lot of people. For me though, it feels honest, it feels natural. I like the angle that it takes, portraying the idea that being a legend is a burden that sometimes gets a little too heavy for any one man to carry. I see people label it as a very pessimistic approach to Luke Skywalker, and I personally could not disagree more with that. I don't look at this film as something that shows Luke to be a man defeated. I see him wrestling with the consequences of being expected to carry the future on his shoulders, and I think it does it in such a way that you're almost reaching when you're trying to portray this negatively. Character development for my hero? Not on my fucking watch. The moment we find out that he failed Ben, that he let fear win for a measly second, is one of my favourite scenes in the trilogy because it reframes the heroism as something fragile and human. There's also a visual fragility in the landscape that Luke surrounds himself in. The island isn't mystical or grand, it's lonely and isolated. There's a sense that everything that's to happen here has already happened, and Luke is simply living in the aftermath. He moves with this tired, almost distant nature, but it's not the end of his story. He isn't left just to wither away in guilt. With Rey's presence and Yoda's later guidance, he slowly and reluctantly begins to understand that his failure wasn't final. It was just the penultimate step in his journey. Mistakes don't have to define you. He comes to realise how misguided he's let himself become, and that in the galaxy's desperate time of need, the most powerful thing he could do is just show up. His final stand isn't meant to portray dominance or destruction, at least that's definitely not how I see it. It's a projection, a symbol and a reminder. Luke chooses to become the myth again, but this time it's on his own terms. He becomes the spark, the Force is truly reborn, all because Luke Skywalker chose to stand. His death in my eyes is a fitting and damn near perfect end to the character. Luke for many epitomises the concept of a Jedi, and for me at least, to see him go out in the way that a Jedi should, throwing himself down for defence rather than outright offence, it's weirdly beautiful. Say what you want about Luke and his characterization in The Last Jedi, I know a lot of people already have. I do understand that a lot of this is up to personal interpretation, but I will always remember a character that shows us their deepest, darkest flaws, rather than one that represents a pure, optimistic approach and never seems to be fazed by anything. My favourite parts of The Last Jedi are the moments where it takes the time to slow down the war and focus on the two characters who are stuck between the stories they've been told and the people they're destined to become. Rey and Kylo are conventional opposites, both representing light and dark respectively, but the film doesn't frame them as enemies, it frames them as mirrors. Despite each being aligned to a side, neither of them truly knows who they are. Rey is desperate to find purpose, to understand why she was left on Jakku as a child. Kylo knows where he came from and wants to burn it all down. It creates this interesting dynamic where two characters on diverging paths converge in their journeys. The moments between the two strip away all of the external noise and reduce their existence to a simple question. What if these two are the only ones who can understand each other? Rey sees that vulnerability within Kylo, and he sees her loneliness, her need for purpose. That's what elevates the throne room scene so much for me. You know, on top of being cool as hell. Oh, wait, hang on a second. Huh? I mean, okay, fair enough. Okay, apparently there's a slight inconsistency in the throne room scene, so I'm now no longer allowed to think it's cool. For a second here, the franchise feels as though it's about to be turned on its head. The duo fights side by side, with Snoke being killed and the Praetorian guards falling one by one in one of the most visually striking sequences of the franchise, and then it's followed by silence. Rey fails in her attempts to bring Kylo back, and Kylo fails in his attempts to win over Rey. Instead, this chasm is created between the two. Rey offers redemption and Kylo offers power, and neither seems to be willing to accept what the other wants to give. It's a breaking point for both of these people. They both want to save each other, but in having such different concepts of how that can be done, they end up broken. There is a strong feeling within this dynamic that I feel very accurately depicts the weight of choice. Kylo chooses to fill the power vacuum that was left with the death of Snoke, and Rey chooses to continue on with that compassion that has got her this far. But neither of them is unaffected by the time they've spent together. They both do definitely grow from this, even if it is in different directions. There's a steady ache of knowing that despite their strengthened connection, empathy doesn't always lead to understanding. For Rey, this is the moment she stops waiting for someone to tell her who she is. She doesn't get that legacy connection, she gets the truth. Her parents were no one, and for a brief moment, that feels like rejection, but it's also freedom in a weird way. And with this, the audience also does get an intelligence test, because they're tasked with figuring out whether this is then contradicted in The Rise of Skywalker with the revelation of Rey's lineage. I mentioned it several times in last week's video, but it's a shame how the trilogy handles the character of Finn past the first movie, because with the themes of this film, Finn should have been poised to have a much bigger part of the story. A few years ago, I did make a video highlighting why I felt that Finn's story for the character in this film progressed him and made sense. And while I do still feel that the story represents an element of growth for the character, I now do have a lot more context to the situation and insight into the reasons as to why it's seen as a massive mistake, and I do agree to an extent. Firstly, I want to say that I do still think the starting point for Finn in this story makes sense, because at the end of the day, it was The Force Awakens, the film that is praised for handling him best, that set him up to be separated from Rey. This is a recurring issue, but it does annoy me to no end that many people will blame Rian Johnson for that aspect of the film, and not J.J. Abrams, who had set it up in his film. Looking back, there are a lot of issues with Rian Johnson's handling of Finn, but this in my eyes is definitely not one of them. I do also still believe that his story should have been separate to Rey's, as there's no way that Acto stuff works as well if there's an additional character there. And vice versa, I don't think Finn would get the attention he needed if he was the third character in that dynamic. He needed to lead something here. However, I now feel educated on everything that happened well enough to say that there is definitely something frustrating about the consequences and the impact of Finn's side mission, even if a lot of the purpose there is character development. His trip to Canto Bight in search of the Codebreaker with Rose could have been a window into what the Resistance is fighting for, and at moments it does try to touch on that, but the execution of it feels a little rushed, tonally uneven, sort of like it belongs in a different film. Finn's journey here is about learning what it means to fight for something bigger than himself. He starts out trying to run, again. This then leads to the criticism that he wouldn't abandon everything after the development he has in The Force Awakens, but then you actively get to remind people that this is technically untrue and doesn't ruin anything, because one of the main things he wants to do by running away is find Rey and keep her safe. You know, the one thing that he was shown to have cared about more than anything else in The Force Awakens. By the end of the movie, his arc has clearly had an effect, as he's willing to give his life for the Resistance. But we just don't see enough of that internal conflict for me. We don't really sit with his trauma, we don't get to see him process any of it, and I do genuinely believe that this is the biggest issue with the execution of his character here. It's just such a shame because Boyega clearly gives so much to this role, as he does everywhere else. He brings this perfect balance of vulnerability, fire, charm. You want to follow Finn, but his story doesn't get enough time to breathe amongst everything else happening. His connection with Rose is also sweet, and I really like the dynamic that the two of them have, and I'm really stoked to see what they do with the pair going forward. The representation of a hero is something that The Last Jedi makes a habit of playing with. It takes the usual concepts and it flips them. Instead of rewarding big explosive actions, it challenges them by asking harder questions. Who gets to lead? What are we fighting for? What the hell does winning even look like? That shift is most obviously shown here in Poe Dameron. In The Force Awakens, he's confident, instinctive, fearless, and he's still all of that here, but the film doesn't exactly celebrate that this time, framing it as a hindrance. When Poe leads that bombing run at the beginning of the film, the victory comes with massive loss, and Leia calls it what it is: a waste. Poe's ego resulted in people losing their lives, and that brings us on to Holdo, someone who doesn't match his energy. She doesn't explain herself, and she doesn't perform her authority in a way that he's comfortable with, and this unsettles him. We're instinctually made to side with Poe given her predetermined attachment to him, and he assumes that he's entitled to answers, clashing directly with Holdo's primary desire to protect what remains of the Resistance. The choice she makes to hold the line, to trust in a bigger plan, and to sacrifice herself with some ceremonious send-off is one of the most powerful statements that The Last Jedi makes about leadership. And during that beautiful sequence that is the Holdo maneuver, it becomes clear that real courage isn't something that announces itself through some brave spectacle. Sometimes it's simply represented by clarity. Rose plays into this idea too, but in a quieter way. She's not a Jedi or a pilot, she's a maintenance worker who just believes in an idea. And in the end, when Finn is facing down the barrel of the gun, she stops him. Not because she doesn't believe in him, but because dying for something isn't the same as living for it. Her proclamation of winning by saving what we love was a line that was mocked and laughed at, but the more time I spend with the film, the more I love it. It's the moment that the film quietly lays down the philosophy. It's about survival, about kindness, about choosing life again and again in a galaxy that constantly demands sacrifice. Heroism in The Last Jedi isn't represented through any individual act. It's not a case of making the biggest explosion or pulling the biggest move. It's about the ability to change, to listen and develop, and to hold the line when no one is taking notice. It understands that saving the galaxy isn't about making yourself the centre of the story, it's about building the future for others to step into. Just as all the other films do, The Last Jedi speaks volumes through the images. The emotion is carried in the colour, silence, framing, in the way that characters are dwarfed by space or isolated in these wide, still shots that leave room for interpretation. Rian Johnson had a distinct visual language that he wanted to communicate, and he did that tremendously. The throne scene is a perfect example to look at here. That deep crimson red is the kind of space that makes the sequence feel like a stage rather than a battlefield. The colours scream danger and temptation, passion and violence, and yet, within all of that fire, there's a deep intimacy here. Two characters reaching out, trying to forge something new in the ashes of everything that has burned around them. Or the Holdo maneuver, something that is consumed in silence. The absence of any sound is deafening in its own right. It tears through the usual expectation and demands stillness. It's the kind of visual that leaves a distinct mark on us. But Luke's standoff is probably my favourite example of this. Crate by design is a metaphor. The red concealed underneath the white, the truth beneath the legend. Luke's presence is there carefully, intentionally off. There's no footprints, no physical contact, the whole scene plays like a riddle up until the reveal, and when we cut back to Luke, alone, meditating and staring into the twin suns as they set over his story, we're reminded that this was never about power. It was about peace, closure, a final, gentle goodbye. The Last Jedi isn't a perfect movie. 3 years ago I may have tried to argue that, but now it's clear to me that parts of this movie can be frustrating, feel undercooked or awkwardly placed, and yet, it's still my favourite Star Wars movie. At its core, it's a film that is heavily influenced by the idea of change, not within the galaxy, but the change it demands of the audience. It asks you to let go of what you thought things were, to make room for uncertainty, for contradiction, and something more human. And that is what keeps pulling me back in. It's the honesty, the way it deconstructs failure, the way it strips back the heroes and asks them to stop performing and just fucking listen. It's easy to love a film when it delivers on exactly what you'd expect, but I think it's a deeper kind of love when that feeling is still felt despite how much a film challenges you. When it disappoints you in one scene only to blow you away in the next. When it forces you to sit with what could have been while still appreciating what is. The Last Jedi is one of those movies that reminds me of why I fall in love with stories in the first place. It's not always the perfection of it all, because no film is perfect and this is certainly no exception, but it's how tight it can feel despite clear messiness. It's full of hope, tension and imperfection, but that's like all of us. We're now headed into the final week where we're going to be looking at The Rise of Skywalker, which is a film title that I have been dreading mentioning up until now. I'm also dreading talking about how I feel about it, because if this doesn't do well, I don't know how a positive video on The Rise of Skywalker is going to do, and you're going to hear all about why I love this movie next Wednesday, should you care to hear me out. So until then, take care.